Hello once again, dear ones, and welcome to the fourth part of our course on the Pentateuch. In the previous two sections, we briefly touched upon various parts of the book of Genesis and the main important characters in the narrative of God's people, specifically Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. During this session and the next session, we will literally turn the page into a new book of the Bible and learn about the second book in the Pentateuch and the second book in the Bible, the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus includes perhaps the most important story in the Old Testament. The story told here is referenced throughout not only the rest of the Old Testament, but also into the New Testament. It is a foundational story for both Judaism and Christianity. The story of Exodus is a story of how the Hebrew people were set free from slavery in Egypt and spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness, following God's guidance and the leadership of a guy named Moses. There are obviously a lot of stories which are contained within that overarching narrative, and we're going to spend the next two classes focusing on some of the highlights of those stories. If you have the time, though, I recommend reading the whole book of Exodus. It is so important, and there's just so much in there. So let's see here. When we left off last time, we had just finished the book of Genesis with Joseph and his father Jacob and his brothers who had moved to Egypt because Joseph was the second in command of Pharaoh. And so his family was in good standing with Pharaoh, and they were safe there in Egypt. In fact, Joseph was in such good standing that after he died, his bones remained in Egypt, and his family continued to be treated well. Well, 300 years go by, and generations come and go. And as it says in the beginning of Exodus, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Since that king didn't know Joseph or his family, the family fell from grace and became slaves in Egypt, along with all the Hebrew people. And they were treated poorly, and they were oppressed because the new Pharaoh was afraid of the number of Hebrew people that they were. He was afraid that they would overthrow him since there were so many of him, so he oppressed them. To stop them from increasing in number anymore, the Pharaoh ordered that all male babies actually should be killed when they are born. One of the boys that was born at this time was named Moses, and he becomes one of the heroes of our story, and the main character, to be sure. Moses, when he was born, was saved. To save him from being killed, his mother and his sister put him in a basket and sent him down the Nile River, hoping that he would end up in safety. And he ended up in none other than Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh's daughter happened to see the baby in the basket and chose to save the boy and bring him out of the water. Moses means to bring out of the water. I told you names were important. So she picked him up out of the water and chose to save him and raise him as her own. And so Moses, from the age of 3 months, was taken in as a Hebrew to be part of Pharaoh's house. He was a descendant of Joseph, who was raised in wealth and prosperity as a son of the king. In fact, Moses' own mother worked in Pharaoh's house and helped raise him. Pretty crazy, right? Moses' mom gave him up and then got to raise him anyway because she worked in Pharaoh's house. I wonder if they knew where that part of the Nile led. Because Moses was actually raised by his own mother, as he was growing up, he heard stories of the Hebrew people. Throughout his whole childhood, he felt a kinship with them. So when he saw a Hebrew being beaten when he was an adult, his heart was moved to anger and he ended up killing the guy who was beating the Hebrew, an Egyptian. And for fear of being killed himself by Pharaoh, Moses ran away to a place called Midian until that current Pharaoh died. Things, however, did not get better for the Hebrew people when the next Pharaoh rose to power, Moses' brother. In fact, they got worse. And the people cried out to God to save them. And God heard their groaning and responded. Moses, at this time, was still living in Midian with his wife on the land of his father-in-law Jethro, taking care of sheep and living a pretty low-key life. He probably could have stayed there for a very long time, perhaps even died there. He was happy and content. But God had other plans, as is so often the case. While Moses was tending his father-in-law's flock in the wilderness, suddenly a flame appeared in a bush and started to speak to him, saying, "Moses, I have heard the cry of my people in Egypt, and I know their sufferings. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses wasn't so sure about that. I mean, he fled because he was afraid that he was going to die. But God promised to be with him and to guide him throughout the process and to lead them all to a land flowing with milk and honey. And God told Moses what God's name was. I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. Telling God's name is a pretty big deal. But that wasn't enough for Moses to be convinced. And so God showed Moses a miracle, actually a couple miracles, by changing his staff into a snake and then back into a staff. And changing Moses' hand into a leper's hand and then back into a healed hand. And he promised that in front of Pharaoh, Moses would be able to turn water from the Nile into blood. That God would give Moses this power to show that he was serious and that God was on his side. But Moses was still not convinced because he was self-confident. He was not confident. He was self-conscious about speaking well in front of Pharaoh or anyone. So God promised that Moses could bring Aaron to speak to the people. Aaron was Moses' brother. And finally, Moses ran out of excuses. He was convinced and went to speak to Pharaoh with his brother Aaron by his side. But it didn't go so well for them the first time. Pharaoh sent Moses and Aaron away and made the Hebrew people work even harder without straw to make their bricks. Straw is a really important ingredient in the process to help bricks stay together, and that's what the Hebrew people did. Not only did he take away their straw, Pharaoh wanted the Hebrew people to make even more bricks than they had before. He made them work even harder because he was so offended by Aaron and Moses. Moses was taken aback by this turn of events. He thought that he was just going to be able to walk out of the land, maybe. He didn't think that the hardship would get worse for the Hebrew people. And he talks to God about it. But God promises once again that the Hebrew people will be freed, and they will be given a land flowing with milk and honey. They would be released from slavery, and God sends Aaron and Moses back to visit Pharaoh. There's quite a bit of back and forth which happens between God and Pharaoh through the conversations Moses and Aaron have with Pharaoh. And as a result of each of these conversations, plagues come upon the Egyptian people and the land. 10 plagues to be exact. Each time Pharaoh considers freeing the people, sometimes saying that he's going to let them go. But each time, Pharaoh rethinks that decision and holds on to the Hebrew people sometimes making their labor even harder. I mean, if he lets them go, what will that do to his reputation? Everyone will rise up against him. What will that do to his workforce? Who's going to make bricks? Who's going to build the pyramids? So each time, Pharaoh takes back the promise to let them go. The Nile turned to blood, but that wasn't enough. There were frogs and gnats and flies and diseased livestock and boils and thunder and hail and locusts and even complete darkness in the land, but that was not enough to free God's people. Pharaoh still would not let God's people go. He would not release them from slavery. And then the 10th plague comes. The plague which mirrors the way the book of Exodus starts, with the death of the firstborn child. But this time it's not the firstborn of the Hebrews that will die. It is the firstborn of the Egyptians. God, through Moses, warned the Hebrew people that their moment was coming. And they were to pack up and get ready to leave Egypt, for this would surely be the time when they would be set free, but they would need to move quickly. They prepared with a final meal to remember the day, the meal which is still called Passover. For the Lord passed over the houses of the Hebrew people and killed only the Egyptians. Pharaoh was greatly distraught at the death of his son, and he finally let the Hebrew people go. And they went. Led by Moses, the Hebrews fled the land of Egypt and began their journey to the promised land. And that's where we will pick up the story next time. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.